If you're watching this, hoping to feel motivated, you should probably leave now. This isn't a comfort video, and it's not here to make you feel seen in a warm, flattering way. It's here to point at something most people avoid, because once you notice it, you can't unsee it. You weren't ignored because you weren't enough. You were ignored because you were always there. You replied fast, so delays made your body tense. When the message was opened and left unanswered, you didn't get angry, you waited. You told yourself they were busy, distracted, tired, anything except the simplest explanation. You had trained them that access to you was unlimited. That's how someone slowly becomes background noise without anyone ever deciding to disrespect them. Think about how often you stayed available while feeling small. How many times you sat with your phone nearby, volume on, pretending you didn't care while your attention stayed parked. Picture a room you're usually in, then imagine one day you're not there. The chair is empty. Nobody asks where you went. The conversation doesn't pause. That moment isn't dramatic. It's quiet, and that's why it hurts. And here's the uncomfortable reversal. People don't miss you when you're present. They miss the convenience you provided. That's the cost of becoming invisible. The exhaustion doesn't come from being hurt. It comes from constantly making sure no one else feels discomfort at your expense. You're not exhausted because of conflict. You're exhausted because you prevented it. You didn't fight, you smoothed things over. You didn't raise your voice, you lowered your expectations. Every time tension appeared, you stepped in first, explained it away, softened the edges, carried the emotional weight so no one else had to feel uncomfortable. You became the peacekeeper without ever agreeing to the role. You were always the one who texted first after silence, the one who checked in, the one who said, "I get it," even when nothing about it felt fair. And the part that drains you most is that no one asked you to do this. You volunteered quietly, because keeping the connection felt safer than risking distance. So you learned to swallow irritation and call it maturity. You learned to translate neglect into understanding. You learned to accept crumbs and convince yourself they were enough. Look at how often you were the emotional buffer, the human shock absorber, the person who absorbed bad moods, mixed signals, last-minute cancellations, and vague apologies, so the relationship could keep moving without friction. That kind of exhaustion doesn't come from drama. It comes from self-erasure. You weren't falling apart loudly, you were fading silently. And no one apologizes for that kind of damage because it doesn't look like harm from the outside. It looks like you're easygoing, flexible, low maintenance. But inside, something was being drained every time you chose understanding over honesty, availability over self-respect. Here's the shift most people never make. You weren't too much, you were too available. And availability without limits doesn't build closeness, it builds entitlement. That exhaustion you felt in the last part isn't a personal flaw. It's the predictable result of how power actually works between people. And this is where Machiavelli enters the picture. Machiavelli wasn't cruel, and he wasn't teaching revenge, manipulation, or emotional games. He was simply honest about a rule most people only understand after they've been drained. Human beings don't respect what they can fully control, they rely on it. Reliance feels safe, but it quietly kills value. Respect begins at the edge of access. Machiavelli understood that power is psychological long before it is physical. It lives in perception, not in how much you give or how loudly you explain yourself. When something is always available, the mind stops registering its importance. Think about something ordinary, like Wi-Fi. When it works, you don't appreciate it. You don't even notice it. The moment it disappears, routines collapse and anxiety shows up. Not because you love Wi-Fi, but because your system depends on it. The same mechanism governs relationships. Constant presence creates dependency without respect. Absence, when chosen deliberately, creates awareness without confrontation. Power isn't in presence. It's in what people can no longer reach. If absence creates awareness, confrontation usually destroys it. And this is where most people quietly give back whatever leverage they had left. You were taught that speaking up is mature, that explaining your feelings leads to understanding, that if you say it clearly enough, something will finally change. But confrontation only works when the other person already respects your value. And if you're still here, that respect was never part of the equation. When you speak, they don't reflect. They respond. They explain why you're misreading things. They soften the moment with phrases that sound caring but demand nothing from them. I didn't mean it. You're overthinking. That's not what I was trying to do. Each line is designed to calm you, not to correct behavior. You leave lighter for a moment, relieve the tension past, convinced progress was made. And weeks later, you're back in the same place. The pattern resets because confrontation gave them exactly what they needed. Reassurance without consequence. You gave emotional labor, clarity, and another chance, while they offered comfort language and empty promises. That's why confronting someone who undervalues you feels exhausting instead of empowering. You're not setting boundaries. You're negotiating your worth with someone who benefits from keeping it low. Think about how many times you explained your needs, chose your words carefully, avoided sounding dramatic, only to end up right where you started. Here's the uncomfortable pivot. This video isn't here to teach you how to argue better or be understood more clearly. It exists to show you why clarity without leverage changes nothing, and why being understood never protected you. If this hits uncomfortably close, don't scroll past it. Notice who came to mind and stay. Because what comes next explains why walking away works when nothing else ever did. Explanation gives them comfort. Absence gives them consequence. What comes next after understanding absence is where most people make the wrong move. They confront. And that single decision quietly hands back all the power they just regained. You were taught that speaking up is healthy, that explaining your feelings leads to clarity, that if you finally say it out loud, they'll understand and adjust. But confrontation only works when the other person already respects your value. And if you've been invisible, that respect was never part of the equation. When you speak, they don't change. They manage. They explain why you're reading it wrong. They soften the moment with language that sounds caring but demands nothing. I didn't mean it. You're overthinking. That's not what I was trying to do. Each phrase is designed to calm you down, not to alter their behavior. You leave the conversation feeling temporarily lighter, relieve the tension past, believing progress was made. And weeks later, you're standing in the exact same place. This video exists to interrupt that loop. It's not here to teach you how to communicate better, express yourself more clearly, or argue more effectively. Its purpose is to show you why clarity without leverage changes nothing, and why being understood never protected you in the first place. You're not here to learn how to convince someone to value you. You're here to understand why convincing was always the wrong strategy. Confrontation gives them reassurance without consequence, another chance without cost, and proof that you'll stay engaged no matter how little changes. That's why confronting someone who undervalues you feels exhausting instead of empowering. You're not setting boundaries. You're negotiating your worth with someone who benefits from keeping it low. Explanation gives them comfort. Absence gives them consequence. After confrontation collapses, silence takes control, and this is where the first real shock lands. Not as sadness, but as disorientation. When you disappear, nothing dramatic happens. Their system simply stops working the way it used to. You were never just someone they cared about. You were a function built into their routine. You absorbed chaos without complaint. You replied on time. You regulated moods. You made emotional friction disappear. When that function vanishes, the structure around it buckles. They open your chat by reflex, thumb hovering, waiting for the familiar release of your presence. And nothing arrives. Not an excuse. Not a delay. Just absence. The habit fires and hits a wall. The day feels off in small ways that stack up quickly. Conversations feel heavier. Irritation lingers instead of draining away. There is no one to dump frustration onto and feel clean afterward. No one quietly smoothing rough edges so life keeps moving. The chaos you used to absorb stays inside their system now, bouncing around with nowhere to go. That's why they don't feel grief yet. Grief is emotional. This is mechanical. People don't panic when something leaves. They panic when something stops functioning. And you were something that functioned. You made their world easier through access alone. Without you, delays stretch. Emotions echo. Problems repeat. They check again. They refresh. They wait. The system keeps reaching for a resource that no longer exists. This moment connects directly to what came before. Because absence doesn't argue like confrontation did, it removes the stabilizer entirely. That's the misunderstanding most people have. You didn't leave their heart, you left their routine. And once a routine breaks, the mind can't pretend everything is fine. It unsettles them in quiet moments, during drives, during pauses, during tasks that used to feel automatic. The absence creates friction everywhere at once. They feel slower, less regulated, more exposed to their own reactions. Small stresses feel larger because there is no outlet. This is the first crack in their sense of control. The moment they realize something essential is missing but can't be replaced. That realization doesn't scream. It hums, persistent, unresolved, and impossible to ignore once it starts. And this is only the beginning of what silence sets in motion. Nothing about this is accidental. It follows rules you never learned before now. Once their routine collapses, the mind tries to repair the damage. And this is where silence turns inward and begins asking questions they can't control. The first questions aren't poetic or emotional. They're sharp and repetitive, looping without resolution. Did I mess up? Did I say something wrong? Why didn't they fight for this? Why didn't they explain? Why didn't they try harder to stay? Silence doesn't give answers. It removes distraction. And without distraction, the mind becomes a courtroom with no judge. They replay conversations they dismissed at the time. They revisit moments they brushed past because you were always there anyway. At 2 a.m, they scroll aimlessly, not looking for anything specific, just trying to quiet the pressure building behind their eyes. They open old messages. They reread neutral lines, searching for hidden meaning. During casual conversations, someone mentions your name, and their body reacts before their thoughts do. A pause, a tightening, a sudden drop they weren't prepared for. This isn't nostalgia. It's interrogation. Silence doesn't argue like you did. It doesn't clarify. It doesn't soften language. It forces questions to echo until something breaks. And the most unsettling part is that the questions don't point outward forever. At first, they ask about you. Then they turn inward. Why do people leave me? Why do I always assume they'll stay? Why didn't I notice the shift sooner? This is where absence becomes dangerous to the ego. You were supposed to be infinite. bottomless, always reachable. Your silence violates that assumption, and violations demand explanation. But there is no explanation coming. The loop never closes. Each unanswered question tightens the psychological pressure, because the mind cannot tolerate unfinished stories. They don't sleep well. They don't focus cleanly. The quiet moments stretch. The noise doesn't help anymore. And slowly, without you saying a word, they are forced to sit with something they avoided for a long time. The possibility that your disappearance wasn't random, and that possibility points back at them. Silence doesn't argue. It interrogates. After silence turns into interrogation, fixation takes over. Because once the mind loses answers, it refuses to let the problem go. This follows directly from the questions that came before. Because unanswered questions don't dissolve, they compound. The human brain is wired to complete stories. When a narrative breaks midstream, attention locks in until the ending appears. Think about a TV series that gets canceled halfway through a season. No finale, no resolution. Years later, people still argue about it, replay it, speculate endlessly, not because it was perfect, but because it never finished. Your disappearance creates the same effect. You don't become a memory. You become a question mark. They replay the last interaction, searching for a hidden signal that explains everything. They scan timelines, mutual connections, social cues, not because they want you back, but because they need the loop to close. This is where most people misunderstand kindness. They think closure is compassion. It isn't. Closure is relief. Relief allows the mind to relax, justify itself, and move on. When you offer no explanation, the loop stays open, and open loops hijack attention. That's why thoughts of you show up at random moments, not as longing, but as pressure. The brain wants an ending so it can release the file, and you've denied it one. That denial isn't cruelty, it's consequence. They aren't obsessed with you as a person, they're trapped by an unresolved process. You've become the variable they can't solve. Every unanswered question tightens the loop. Why didn't you explain? Why didn't you give a reason? Why did it end like this? The quieter you remain, the louder those questions become. This is the moment absence stops being emotional and becomes mechanical. An unfinished loop consumes mental bandwidth, disrupts sleep, and resurfaces in idle moments because the mind hates loose ends. And here's the uncomfortable truth that follows. If you had explained yourself, they would have felt relieved, justified, or absolved, and you would have been forgotten. By saying nothing, you remain unresolved. If this makes you uneasy, don't rush to soothe it. Notice how often you were taught to give closure for someone else's comfort. Stay with this video, because what comes next shows how that open loop doesn't just trap their attention, it reshapes how they see you. Closure is permission to forget. Once the loop refuses to close, the mind looks for relief. And this is where myth-making begins. Because ego cannot live long without a story that protects it. This connects directly to the open loop from before. Because when answers never arrive, the brain doesn't wait patiently. It invents explanations. They start telling themselves a version of you that makes their discomfort tolerable. You were unstable. You were dramatic. You disappeared for attention. You were never that important anyway. These stories don't exist to understand you. They exist to anesthetize guilt. Admitting that they undervalued someone reliable, patient, and present would force a reckoning the ego resists at all costs. So the narrative shifts. History gets edited. Your consistency becomes clinginess. Your silence becomes manipulation. Your boundaries become flaws. But myths are fragile structures. They require constant reinforcement. Every time someone asks about you, the story must be retold. Every time they remember a moment that contradicts the narrative, the myth must be adjusted. That maintenance costs energy. Emotional bandwidth is spent defending a fiction. And that's where the pressure builds. They might say out loud that they're better off, that it was for the best, that nothing was lost. But privately, the myth wobbles. Reality leaks in through small cracks, familiar places, shared memories, moments when your absence feels heavier than the explanation they rehearsed. This isn't growth, it's survival. The mind would rather live inside a comfortable lie than face an uncomfortable truth. And the truth they're avoiding is simple. You didn't vanish because you were unstable. You vanished because the dynamic was. The more they repeat the myth, the more invested they become in it, because abandoning it would mean facing their role in losing you. That's why the story gets louder over time, not quieter. Pride needs protection. Truth does not. Myths exist to protect pride, not truth. Once the myth is in place, something stranger happens. The story can speak, but memory doesn't obey it. This follows directly from the myth they built, because even the best narrative can't control involuntary recall. You start appearing without being there. A smell in a hallway pulls a reaction before thought arrives. A familiar phrase slips out of someone else's mouth and their body tightens. Music, places, routines, all become triggers they didn't authorize. This isn't longing, it's intrusion. Psychologists call it intrusive recall, moments when memory bypasses intention and forces itself forward. They can't schedule it, they can't prepare for it. It shows up while driving, showering, or standing in line, and it ignores whatever story they told themselves to stay comfortable. The myth says you were unstable. The body remembers consistency. The myth says you didn't matter. The nervous system remembers regulation. This is where absence turns into a ghost. You're nowhere in reality, but everywhere in their mental landscape. They might think they're over you. They might say your name casually, without weight. And then it happens. A laugh sounds like yours. A sentence lands the same way you used to speak. For a split second, the myth collapses and reality pushes through. That moment doesn't last long, but it doesn't need to. Repetition does the damage. Each unexpected reminder weakens the story they worked so hard to maintain. This connects back to the open loop, because unfinished processes don't fade, they resurface. And it connects back to the system break, because the stabilizer is still missing. They try to replace you with noise, with new people, with distractions. But the echo remains. It keeps returning precisely because they tried to suppress it, because suppression strengthens recall. And every attempt to forget adds friction, turning ordinary moments into reminders, until the effort to move on becomes harder than facing what the silence already exposed inside. You aren't haunting them intentionally. You're haunting them structurally. You left physically. You stayed psychologically. And that contradiction is exhausting, because they can't argue with a memory that arrives uninvited. After the ghost settles in, something heavier follows. Not love and not longing, but revaluation. And this connects directly to the phantom presence, because memory forces comparison. When you were present, you were cheap, accessible, always available, and the mind priced you accordingly. Now that you're gone, the market corrects. This isn't romance, it's accounting. They don't suddenly want you back because emotion returned. They reassess you because absence exposed cost. They start noticing what quietly disappeared when you were around, the calm that's gone, the problems that linger, the emotional cleanup no one handles anymore. That's when the thought forms, slow and painful, I mispriced them. Not because you changed, but because the conditions did. Value was always there. It just couldn't be seen under unlimited access. This is why regret arrives late. It isn't dramatic or loud, it's clinical. They see the gap between what they paid and what they lost, and that gap doesn't close. Markets don't reopen just because someone finally understands their mistake. You were worth more, and they spent you like you were replaceable. This realization doesn't inspire action. It produces weight. A dull pressure that shows up when things fall apart, and there's no one left to absorb the chaos. Pride goes quiet here, because pride can't argue with math. The ledger doesn't care about intention, it only records the outcome. And the outcome is simple. Life costs more without what they took for granted. They don't miss you for who you were, they miss you for what stopped working without you. By the time the price becomes clear, access is already gone. And here's the question this moment leaves behind. If you've ever wondered why people only recognize your value after you leave, this is why. The choice now isn't whether they see it. It's whether you're willing to lower the price again just to be let back in. You weren't worthless. You were underpriced. If you're still framing this as something you did to them, you're standing in the wrong place. Everything up to now wasn't building toward revenge. It was pushing you toward clarity. Disappearing wasn't a message meant to hurt. It was a decision meant to stop harm. This shift matters because punishment keeps your attention locked on the person who benefited from your exhaustion, while self-protection pulls it back where it belongs. The moment you saw the price clearly, staying stopped being loyalty and started becoming self-erasure. Walking away didn't require anger. It required accuracy. You didn't leave to prove a point. You left because the system only worked when you kept absorbing chaos, regulating moods, and shrinking quietly so others could stay comfortable. Removing yourself wasn't dramatic. It was corrective maintenance. Think about how foreign it felt to stop explaining, to stop smoothing, to stop waiting for permission to choose yourself. That discomfort isn't guilt. It's withdrawal from a role you were trained to play. You were rewarded for patience, praised for understanding, and silently expected to keep giving without limit. Leaving breaks that conditioning. That's why it can feel wrong at first. But wrong doesn't mean immoral. It means unfamiliar. Self-protection always looks like hostility to people who relied on your lack of it. This isn't about becoming distant or cold. It's about precision. Precision with your time. Precision with your attention. Precision with what you allow into your nervous system. When you stop calling your absence revenge, it stops pulling you backward and starts opening space forward. No rehearsed explanations, no monitoring reactions, no checking if the lesson landed, just distance, clean and quiet. And in that distance, something shifts. You're no longer defined by being needed. You're defined by what you choose to protect. This wasn't revenge. It was correction. Everything leads here. Because once you stop calling distance revenge and start living inside the correction, a different kind of power appears. It's quiet and it doesn't rush. They may come back, not dramatically, not with clarity. Sometimes it's a message months later. Sometimes it's a reaction, a question disguised as concern, a reminder that they still know how to reach you. But by the time that happens, you're not the same person they left behind. You've already crossed the hardest line, the one most people never cross, staying gone. That's where the real choice lives. You can reopen the door and replay the pattern, reintroduce access, resume absorbing chaos, and call it hope. Or you can recognize what changed inside you when you stopped chasing resolution. You learned how peaceful it feels when your nervous system isn't on standby. You noticed how much space returned when you weren't managing someone else's emotions. You realized that being reachable is not the same as being respected. This isn't about punishing them by withholding. It's about protecting yourself by maintaining structure. Power doesn't come from disappearing once. It comes from not reappearing just because someone is suddenly curious again. Most people fail here. They mistake attention for accountability. They hear a familiar tone and forget the cost. They reopen access and wonder why nothing feels different. Staying gone isn't cruel, it's disciplined. It requires you to trust what you learned instead of what you miss. And that discipline changes how you move everywhere else. You stop over-explaining. You stop negotiating your worth. You stop proving availability as a substitute for value. If you're still watching, don't ask yourself whether they deserve another chance. Ask whether you're willing to abandon the clarity you earned just to feel familiar again. This video isn't asking you to harden. It's asking you to choose precision over repetition. If this resonates, carry it quietly. Apply it without announcing it. Let absence do what arguments never could. You cannot force value, but you can remove access. If this landed, you don't need to say much. A clarity in the comments is enough. Or just leave a heartbeat and move on.